Anytime we talk about America's Christian history or America's Christian heritage, inevitably the topic of separation between church and state comes up. And it's unfortunate that so many people are confused by the phrase. They don't know the origin of the phrase. They really don't know the particulars of how that phrase came into existence. And many of them, of course, don't really know the history behind how that phrase has actually replaced the language of the First Amendment. And so as a result, it becomes incumbent upon us as Christians to kind of go through the maze of misunderstanding to figure out how we as Christians understand this term, see how Christians understood it in the first place and what the Bible has to say about it. Because the earliest settlers here to the United States were in fact Christians who understood the Bible and understood the relationship between church and state. That doesn't mean that they understood it perfectly, but they certainly understood it in such a way as that America became not only a beacon to the world, but also a haven for those who were persecuted overseas. And so while the phraseology, separation of church and state, is confusing to lots of people, I hope in this particular session to outline some of the particulars of the phrase and also to deal with some of the Bible. I think you'll find it surprising that the Bible has a lot to say about the phrase I'm going to use is a jurisdictional separation between church and state. Now, it doesn't help that secularists have muddied the language of the First Amendment. Let me repeat the First Amendment to you. You've heard me in other segments give it, but let me remind you of that language again. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And you'll notice there's no mention of separation, there's no mention of church, and there's no mention of state. Now, the prohibition there is addressed specifically to Congress, that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. We'll see that actually the issue of the Constitution had little to do with a separation between the institution of the church and the institution of the state. It had something to do with the relationship that the federal government, the lawmaking body of our government, Congress, and its relationship with the individual state. So what's happened over the centuries, literally going all the way back to the First Amendment, which was put into the Constitution later and finally ratified in 1791, the separation of church and state language has been used as a substitute for what the First Amendment actually says. So, if we're to understand the proper relationship between church and state, then we must begin with what the Bible has to say about it. If we are going to be articulate on this particular topic, we have to understand it in a biblical context first before we can understand it in a governmental way. And the Bible does have a lot to say about government. I know there are lots of Christians who say, "Oh, we shouldn't get mixed up in politics. Politics is dirty. Jesus didn't get mixed up in politics. You can't impose your morality on other people." But when the Bible uses the phrase government, it isn't always using it in a political way. The Bible addresses government as self-government. The book of Ephesians, you hear self-control. There's family government where fathers and mothers are heads of a household, the father being the leader in the household. Children, in one respect, are subjects under the parents. There's a system of laws. There's sanctions. If you break those laws, then there are ramifications for that. And of course, if you keep the laws related to family government, those who the fifth commandment talks about. Obey your parents in the Lord, and if you do so, you will live long on the earth. There's a positive side to the sanction side regarding obedience to parents and family government. And there's ecclesiastical government. You have church leaders, you have elders and pastors, and you have civil government. And so when the Bible talks about government, it isn't always talking about the political side of government. It's a much broader scope, beginning with the idea that if you don't have good self-government, if you don't have good self-control among the people, then it's going to reflect this poor self-government in family government, church government, and civil government. It's no accident that the Apostle Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 3 says that a person who can't govern himself well certainly isn't going to be able to govern his family well, and if he can't govern his family well, then how can he govern other families in the church? And so the Apostle Paul makes this relationship between the individual, the family, and the church in terms of government, and we'll see a little later on how we find the same thing with Jethro's counsel to his father-in-law Moses when it comes to picking civil rulers. In fact, you can see the parallels in Exodus chapter 18 and 1 Timothy chapter 3. The qualifications are the same for both civil rulers, Exodus 18, and ecclesiastical rulers in 1 Timothy chapter 3. And so if you were going to explain this visually, you could have God as the one at the top who delegates certain governments among men: family government, church government, civil government. And underneath these governments is self-government. And so there's self-government in impacting family government, there's self-government impacting church government, and there's self-government impacting civil government. We get the governments that we have in our society today, including civil government, based upon how we act as self-governors under God. Now, many Christians believe that civil government is purely secular, that it has its own particular kingdom separated from God's kingdom, and that some Christians go so far as to say that civil government is controlled by evil forces. But you won't find that in the Bible. You won't find in the Bible saying that civil government in and of itself is evil. I mean, you have two books of the Bible called Kings. You have this idea that God wanted Israel to have a king. Now, they went outside the boundaries of what God required of a king in 1 Samuel chapter 8. But there's nothing wrong with civil government. Civil government in and of itself is not an evil entity. And the founders didn't believe that civil government was evil. They had a problem with individuals. Governments of all types, family, church, civil, are run by people. People are sinners. And if you go to the book of James, in the very first chapter, you'll read this: "But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Then when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death." And so there are those who have a lust for power in the political sphere of government. Now, that doesn't make government civil government itself the problem. It's the people in government. That's why we're back to the idea that you have to begin with good self-government, good self-control. And you can see this domino effect from the book of Judges all the way to 1 Samuel chapter 8, where every man did what was right in his own eyes, Judges chapter 17, verse 6, and how it affected the family in 1 Samuel, how it affected the church, and then finally the people call out and reject God, and they want a king to rule over them like all the other nations. So the problem is us. It isn't the problem isn't the governments themselves. So as a result, many Christians have bought into the questionable idea that there is a radical separation between church and state, which has been interpreted to mean that there is a separation of God from civil government. That's what the secularists understand the concept of separation of church and state. That's what they think the First Amendment is all about. And they've convinced us as Christians that separation of church and state means to keep God out of government, which is an impossibility, as we'll see. Stanley Fish has an article in the New York Times, which is very interesting in the way that he outlines for us the secular way of understanding the civil government and its relationship to religion. Let me quote a couple of paragraphs of his. "It's okay to argue that a proposed piece of legislation will benefit the economy or improve the nation's health or strengthen national security, but it's not okay to argue that a proposed piece of legislation should be passed because it comports with a verse from the book of Genesis or corresponds to the will of God." So that's the way some people argue. You can propose something, and you can even bring in the idea that there is a kind of a moral foundation to it, but you cannot link it to the idea that God exists. To do that, as secularists typically maintain, is to violate this separation of church and state idea. He goes on to write this: "A somewhat less stringent version of the argument permits religious reasons to be voiced in context of public decision-making, so long as they have a secular counterpart. Thus, citing the prohibition against stealing in the Ten Commandments is all right because there is a secular version of the prohibition rooted in the law of property rights rather than a biblical command. So if Christians come to the public square and say, it is wrong to steal, and even though that Christians are coming to the public square with that ethic, with that morality, then it's okay to bring that because there is a secular counterpart to it which says, well, we value property itself, and so we have a thou shalt not steal counterpart in our ethic as well. Then Fish continues with this one. In a more severe version of the argument, on the other hand, you are not supposed even to have religious thoughts when reflecting on the wisdom or folly of a piece of policy. Not only should you act secularly when you enter the public sphere, you should also think in a secular way. And so these are the various forms that we find ourselves in today. And this last one, where there is no conception at all about any idea that God is a part of this and that there is any law out there that is greater than reason. And so what we need to do is simply reason our way to a right way of looking at government, reason our way to a right way of looking at law. And of course there is an inherent problem of this, and that is there is no morality in matter. If you're an evolutionist, how does someone who does not believe in God even propose the idea that it's wrong to steal or wrong to kill? And I've mentioned this point before. This is the dilemma of pure secularism, of pure materialism. How does one account for thou shalt not steal? How does that one account for thou shalt not murder? This is the dilemma. See, in the Bible you find that there's a jurisdictional separation between church and state. That is, the civil magistrate has his particular jurisdiction in which he operates, and the civil magistrate has his jurisdiction in which he operates. That is, the family, the church, and the state, they each have laws that pertain particularly to the church, to the family, to the church, to the state. Jurisdiction simply means to speak the law in those areas, and there are boundaries around which those are separated from the other institutions. But in a biblical way of looking at reality, God is the one who designates what laws apply to the family, what laws apply to the church, and what laws apply to the state, and of course what laws apply to us individually. If you take yourself out of that way of looking at the world, then you are left pretty much to, que sera, sera, whatever will be, and the grand who says this is right or this is wrong. And invariably you find that the state will come in and make that determination for us. Now there is a further problem of understanding various governmental jurisdictions and limitations, and that is it's found in how do you reconcile the relationship between God and civil government and church government and family government. And a lot of people will look at Matthew chapter 22 verse 21, and you're all familiar with this story, but again let me repeat it to you. Jesus was always had his antagonists who were always trying to trip him up on a question of ethics and logic. And if you go to Matthew chapter 22 verse 21, you'll remember this phraseology. Tell us then, what do you think, Jesus? Is it lawful to give a poll tax to Caesar or not? But Jesus perceived their malice and said, why are you testing me, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used for the poll tax. And they brought him a denarius. And he said to them, whose likeness and inscription is this? They said to him, Caesar's. Then he said to them, then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Now, what's interesting about this is that we don't live under Caesar today. And we live under the Constitution of the United States. And so if you want to say that there is a Caesar that we are obligated to pay unto Caesar, to render under Caesar, it's the Constitution of the United States. But you notice in this particular passage, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. It doesn't say render unto Caesar the things that Caesar demands of you, but that are really the things that really and truly belong to Caesar. Caesar has his own jurisdictional limitations. And see, they bring a coin, and whose image is on this coin? Well, it's Caesar's image. Well, the counter question is, it's not asked, but it is certainly inferred, whose image does Caesar have on himself? And of course, it's God's image. And so Caesar is even obligated to come under God's jurisdiction. Not just us as individuals, but everybody is. Caesar as well. Any civil magistrate created in the image of God is bound to follow God's precepts and God's jurisdictional limitations as they relate to civil government. Now, so that's a very quick introduction into jurisdictions and governmental limitations and how the Bible does in fact address civil government. Civil government is very legitimate. It was created by God. In fact, the civil magistrate is called a minister of God. In Romans chapter 13, he's given the Greek designation diakonos, which this word may sound familiar to you. It's the same word used for a deacon in a church. So the civil magistrate is God's deacon. He's put in a position to serve in a ministerial capacity. In fact, he's to make distinctions between good and evil. And how does he determine what's good and evil? Again, that's not left up to himself. It is, in fact, he is bound by God to find those things in a civil capacity that apply to him, and then to use them in his governing in the civil realm, just like we would do in family government and church government. So, I want to make it very clear at this point that the Bible does not merge church and state. You will find secularists who will say, well, we've got to get away from what the Bible has to say because there was no jurisdictional separation between church and state in the Bible, that they were merged. And so you had actual priests telling the civil magistrate what to do. The priests ruled over the state. This is false from beginning to end. There is a jurisdictional separation between church and state in the Bible. That's why we as Christians shouldn't be afraid of the phrase. In fact, it's a phrase that has some history behind it in the church. John Calvin uses the phrase separation of church and state, not exactly in those words. Martin Luther did the same. Thomas Jefferson wasn't the first one to bring it up, neither was Roger Williams. The idea of a jurisdictional separation between church and state is a biblical concept. Our founders understood this, going all the way back to Jamestown and beyond. They understood it in such a way that they actually wrote it into some of their colonial charters that a minister of the gospel could not serve as a minister of the gospel and a minister in a civil capacity. He would have to give up his ministerial capacity in the church if he wanted to run in a political capacity, because our founders understood that there was a jurisdictional separation between church and state. Now, as we've seen, the Bible teaches that there are multiple jurisdictions with specified functions and limits of authority and power. The family, the church, and the state, which we are calling here civil government. Now, what we need to do is to go back into the Bible and show examples of this jurisdictional separation. And I think once I go through these, you'll find that, hey, yeah, I've seen this, but I never really put all of this together. The first place I want to begin is with the book of Exodus, where, and I mentioned this already, that Jethro gives this counsel to Moses. And Moses, as we'll see, was a civil ruler. And as a civil ruler, he had centralized power in himself. All of the problems of the nation had come to him, and anybody who had any trouble, they had to go through Moses. And Moses was up all day and all night, trying to work out these problems that these people had. So Jethro's counsel is this. He says, teach them the statutes and the laws, and make known to them the way in which they are to walk and the work they are to do. And so Jethro says, look, teach the people the law, self-government. Get them to understand that they have to be self-governors under God, and they also have to be not only self-governors under God, but their families need to be a government under God as well. So get the people to understand this, because it's not good just for the civil magistrate to have this knowledge. Everybody needs to have this knowledge. We need to have this knowledge about our relationship with God and government, because it helps us keep the civil magistrate in check. Now, what about the rulers? The rulers were men who fear God, men of truth, those who hate dishonest gain. It's not just those seeking power who should be in positions of authority, but those who have certain character development, those who are, in fact, who hate dishonest gain. And I had mentioned in 1 Timothy chapter 3, those same qualifications are those in ecclesiastical government. So the principles are here very, very simple. Teach the people the law. Out of these people, elect for yourselves those who have governed in their own households well. Show that they have been good governors at the family level, and then they can rise up in the area of civil government. If a person cannot rule his own family well, Paul says he won't be able to rule other families well. And also, you notice when you look at Exodus chapter 18, that this is a decentralized political order. No longer would Moses be at the top adjudicating all of the issues that came before him, but he would be the adjudicator of last resort. He would be the last one that they would come to. And so Jethro comes and he says that there should be leaders of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. A decentralized political order, very much like what we have here in the United States. We have a series of courts that go all the way up to the Supreme Court. Now, while Moses was the civil ruler, Aaron became the chief ecclesiastical officer, and as high priest he assisted other numerous lesser priests. And Moses did not carry out the duties of a priest, and Aaron did not perform civil tasks. Again, so very early on we begin to see this jurisdictional separation between church and state. The same law of God, the law of God applies to the civil ruler in civil terms, and applies to the ecclesiastical ruler in ecclesiastical terms. Civil rulers were not to take on the position of ecclesiastical rulers, and ecclesiastical, those who performed rituals in the temple were not to jump over into the civil capacity. They were to be jurisdictionally separate. And we begin to see this all the way through the book, the Old Testament. In the days of the judges, Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Gideon, and Samson served as civil rulers, while the sons of Micah, Phinehas, Eli, and the Levites served as in ecclesiastical capacity. So even in the period of the judges, and up through 1 Samuel, which is really a continuation of the period of the judges, you begin to see this jurisdictional separation of church and state maintained. Now, even in the period of corruption, this jurisdictional separation was maintained. Now, during the period of the United Monarchy, King Saul served as a civil official, while Ahimelech ministered as the chief ecclesiastical leader in the nation. David was king, while Abiathar carried out the duties of a priest. Again, jurisdictional separation between church and state. There were civil rulers and there were ecclesiastical rulers. They had their designated positions and duties, and they did not cross the boundaries of those specific duties. David's son Solomon ruled as a civil officer, while Zadok pursued ecclesiastical obligations. King Joash and Jehoiada, the priest, and King Josiah and the priest Hilkiah maintained jurisdictional separation. So even all the way through, up through the divided monarchy, you see here this jurisdictional separation between church and state maintained. And even after the exile, you will find that jurisdictional separation is maintained. You have Nehemiah on the civil side, and you have Ezra on the priestly side. And if you know anything about this period of history, that the role of the Levites, you read the book of Ezra, you'll notice how the Levites have a prominent role to play. And so you had those who were involved in the civil capacity and those who were involved in an ecclesiastical capacity. Then there is this jurisdictional cooperation. Even though there is this jurisdictional separation that's maintained, if you look at Deuteronomy chapter 17, you will see that the Levites and the king were to sit down, and the king was to hear the law being read to him. And it was hopeful that what would happen here is that the church side of things would help the king, the Levites, experts in the law, help the king to understand the law, to show him how the law applied in a civil capacity to him. Both priest and king were required to sit before the law to be instructed, and the priest was to follow guidelines pertaining to ecclesiastical affairs, while the king would glean from Scripture those directives designed for his civil office. Now, if a case was too difficult for the civil ruler to decide, the Bible gives the following instruction. You shall come to the Levitical priest or the judge who is in office in those days, and you shall inquire of them, and they will declare to you the verdict in the case. And this wasn't even unusual here in the United States. The most educated people in the colonies were the ministers. They were the ones who understood the Bible and how it applied to every area of life. And you would find civil rulers coming to an ecclesiastical leader and to find out what the Bible had to say about this issue. Now, again, another point has to be made here. This does not mean that ecclesiastical rulers and civil rulers are going to be always perfect in what they do. You can go back to the colonial government and see that that isn't the case. But this is the way it ought to be, and it's no different today. You have legal experts on one side of the aisle and legal experts on the other side of the aisle on constitutional issues, and they go through and they speculate about how this might apply here or might apply there. So it's no different in our own day and what was going on in Israel's day. So the judges did not follow, and this is very important, the judges did not follow a different standard of righteousness. Both priest and civil ruler looked to the Bible, although there were things within in the priestly order that only applied to the priestly order, and there were things that only applied to the civil magistrate. For example, we know from the New Testament that the civil magistrate has the power of the sword. And we know that the ecclesiastical ruler does not. While the church can excommunicate a member, send them, essentially treat them as an unbeliever, they can't execute anybody. The only governor that has the right to use the sword is the civil magistrate. That's why it's extremely important that you understand the jurisdictional limitations of a civil ruler. If you don't do that, if you give to the civil magistrate much, much more power than he is given either biblically or constitutionally, he has the power of the sword, he's going to wield that sword to force compliance. You can see this in 1 Kings chapter 8, where we see where Saul is chosen as king, and what he's going to do with his political power is outside his jurisdictional boundaries. But this was judgment upon Israel because they had picked a king like all the other nations rather than acknowledge that God was king over them. Now, what's interesting, although Nathan is not an ecclesiastical ruler, Nathan comes up to King David. This just goes to show you that God's word applies even to the king. And Nathan rebukes David because of his sin. And although David did not at first did not know that the rebuke was level against him, he did not act if it was unusual for someone like Nathan to approach a civil magistrate and say, "You have broken the law." We see the same thing in the gospel where John the Baptist makes this comment about Herod. He has violated the seventh commandment. And so a jurisdictional separation between church and state does not mean that there isn't cooperation between church and state. It is incumbent upon the church today as a prophetic voice to let unbelievers know where they are in violation of God's word. Now, one further point needs to be made, and that is crossing the boundaries. Not only do we see a jurisdictional separation between church and state maintained, but there were times when this was violated, and those on the civil side came in and took over the duties and responsibilities and authority on the ecclesiastical side. So there's always a danger of jurisdictional usurpation when, say, civil government removes the jurisdictional boundaries and enters the domain of the church. And this is happening more and more in our own day with hate crime legislation. Happened the same time in Nazi Germany and communist countries, where the state comes in and maintains you will do this under penalty of law and even under penalty of death. And the Bible uses several examples of this to demonstrate it. King Saul assumed the duties of the priests when he offered sacrifices. He stepped out of bounds from his kingly duties. In another place, Saul killed the godly priest Ahimelech because he would not fulfill the king's political goals. So in one case, in 1 Samuel 15, Saul offers sacrifices, and in the place of Ahimelech, he ends up killing him because he wouldn't go along with his goals. There's the same thing with King Jeroboam when he established his state religion in Bethel and Dan. And you read this and you can see where the Levites actually leave the northern kingdom and go south. Then probably the most famous one is King Uzziah, who crossed the boundary. By all he did, he goes into the temple and simply offers incense. That was it. And the king is said to have been proud, and that his pride led him to go beyond his legitimate civil jurisdiction and move into the ecclesiastical area. And he was, in fact, judged by God. He got leprosy, the most dreaded disease in Israel. And while he was chief of state, being the king of Judah, he was not a priest, and King Uzziah could not assume the role of a priest and perform in the most basic ecclesiastical duties. Simply offering incense was enough for God to judge him. And he ignored God's law, he acted corruptly, and he was unfaithful to the Lord, for he entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense. And again, as I mentioned, he was struck with leprosy, lost his kingdom and everything else. He lost access to the temple, was isolated from the general population, lost his kingdom to his son, Jotham, who was over the king's house, judging the people of the land. And it's interesting that Azariah the priest was not passive in the incident. He actually approached the king and opposed what he had to do. And considering that the king Uzziah had the power of the sword and could have killed him, precedent for this with King Saul, he was very, very brave to go up against. Not only did the priest go up Azariah, but he took 80 others with him and with fear of his life. So there are lessons here for us as well. We cannot be passive. We cannot be passive when the state attempts to encroach upon the ecclesiastical jurisdiction, upon the church. We need to keep these jurisdictional separate. At the same time, understand jurisdictional cooperation, act like the priests, act like Nathan, preach the word of God to fullness, not only to the people in the pew, but also to the civil magistrates. Follow what Jethro gave, is that teach these things to the people, raise up from the people who know these things, so that rulers might reflect the proper responsibility and the proper character, so that we might live tranquil and quiet lives.